In the late 1980s, the biggest name in sneakers wasn't Nike, it was Reebok, and Nike was in real trouble. Now, Reebok had passed them and was outselling them by $100 million a year, and the running boom that built them was over, and they completely missed what came next. And the man who built it, Phil Knight, had nearly lost it once already. So today we're going to talk about how Knight clawed his way back from this and how betting the company on a rookie changed everything for Nike until it didn't. In the early 80s, Nike was on top of the world. They'd passed Adidas, they owned about half the American running shoe market. The jogging craze of the 70s had churned Phil Knight into the king of the industry. And then the wave stopped. Here's the thing that's true in business and almost nowhere else. Surviving the hard years and surviving success are two completely different problems. Knight knew how to fight when he had nothing, but he had no idea how to handle having everything. Nike was built for one thing: runners. Serious shoes for serious athletes. That focus is exactly what made them great, and it's exactly what nearly killed them this time. Because Nike was selling to runners, a much bigger group of people was about to start buying athletic shoes, and Nike wasn't making anything for them. The company that saw what Nike missed was Reebok. In 1982, Reebok went after a market Nike didn't take seriously: women's aerobic shoes. One Nike executive reportedly called the whole aerobics craze a bunch of fat ladies dancing to music. So while Nike sneered at it, Reebok built a soft leather shoe designed specifically for women doing aerobics. They called it the Freestyle, and it was comfortable, it looked good in and out of the gym, and it was the first athletic shoe really built for women. It was perfectly timed too, because Jane Fonda's workout tapes were a cultural phenomenon at the time, and aerobics was everywhere, and Reebok was the shoe of the moment. The numbers are almost hard to believe. Reebok went from about $13 million in sales in 1983 to $300 million in sales by 1985 to over $1.5 billion by 1988. And as Reebok rocketed it up, Nike fell. By 1984, Nike's share of the American athletic shoe market had dropped to around 15%. They were sitting on tens of millions of dollars of shoes they couldn't sell, dumping them at $1 a pair to clear them out. In early 1984, they did the thing Knight had spent his whole life trying to avoid. They laid people off. And then it happened. Around 1986 and into 1987, Reebok officially passed Nike to become the #1 athletic shoe brand in America. By 1989, Reebok was still ahead, doing about $1.8 billion a year to Nike's $1.7. The company Phil Knight had nearly died building had been knocked off the mountain by a company selling aerobic shoes to women, a market he'd refused to take seriously. Knight needed a way out, and he found one. And he found one in a 21-year-old rookie who'd never played a single professional game. Now, the way out started with basketball, which is funny because in basketball, Nike was nobody. But Knight and the people around him made a decision. Instead of spreading their basketball money across a bunch of players, was the safe move, by the way, they were going to take the entire budget and put it on one guy. And that one guy was a 21-year-old rookie out of North Carolina named Michael Jordan. And the person pushing hardest for this inside Nike was a guy named Sonny Vaccaro, who was convinced Jordan was worth betting everything on. And Knight backed him. Now, betting your whole basketball division on an unproven rookie was a genuine gamble. Plenty of great college players never become great pros. To make it matters worse, Jordan didn't even want to be with Nike. Jordan wore Converse in college, and his heart was with Adidas. He didn't want to take the meeting with Nike at all, but the person who got him in the room was his mother, Dolores. She told her son to get on the plane and at least listen to what Nike had to say. So in 1984, Jordan flies to Oregon to hear the pitch, and Nike offers him something that nobody offered rookies or really anybody at that time. Not just money, his own shoe, his own line, and his name on it, the Air Jordan. The deal was 5 years, around $2.5 million, plus something really unusual at the time: a royalty on every shoe sold. For a rookie in 1984, the numbers were stunning. Nike's own internal projection, the number they were hoping for, was the Air Jordan line might do about $3 million in sales by the end of year 4. That was the goal, $3 million over 4 years. The Air Jordan did $126 million in its first year. They missed their own projection by about 40 times in the right direction. You've heard that the NBA banned the Air Jordan, that Michael Jordan got fined $5,000 every game for wearing them, and that Nike happily paid the fine. And that is a wonderful story, except most of it isn't quite true. The shoe the league flagged wasn't even the Air Jordan 1. It was an earlier Nike shoe called the Airship in a black and red color scheme back in October of 1984. The NBA at the time had a rule that shoes had to be mostly white and match your team. The black and red shoe broke that rule, and the league sent Nike a letter about it in February 1985, but there's no actual evidence that Jordan ever wore the banned black and red Air Jordan 1 in a regular season game. The one time he wore that color on the court was the 1985 slam dunk contest, but the uniform rules don't apply there. So what really happened is Nike took a minor uniform dispute over a different shoe, blurred the lines on purpose, and built a brilliant ad campaign around the idea that the NBA was trying to keep you from wearing these shoes. The ban was mostly marketing, but it was genius marketing. They turned a rule violation into the most rebellious shoe on the planet, but the cartoon version, fined every game, paid every time, that's almost entirely a myth. The truth is actually a better story. They didn't get lucky with a ban, they manufactured the whole thing. Now, Jordan gave Nike basketball, but Knight's comeback needed more than one athlete. It needed to make the whole brand feel like the future again. So in 1987, Nike did something a little crazy. They put a window in the shoe, a visible pocket of air you could actually see in the sole, the Air Max. The designer, who was a former architect named Tinker Hatfield, got the idea from a building in Paris that turned itself inside out and put its guts on the outside. It made Nike look like technology again, like the company that was ahead instead of the company that got passed. And then in 1988 came three words that changed everything. Nike's ad agency, a small Portland shop called Wieden & Kennedy, was trying to tie all of Nike's different ads together with one line, and the founder, Dan Wieden, came up with it. The first commercial aired on July 1st, 1988, and it featured an 80-year-old man named Walt Stack jogging across the Golden Gate Bridge. The line was "Just do it." Dan Wieden has said on the record that he got the phrase from the last words of a man named Gary Gilmore. Gilmore was a convicted murderer who was executed by firing squad in 1977. Right before they shot him, he said, "Let's do it." Wieden changed "let's" to "just," and that became the most famous tagline in advertising history. But here's the Phil Knight part, and it's my favorite detail in this whole episode. Knight hated it. When the agency brought him "Just do it," Knight's reaction was, and this is documented, was basically, "We don't need that." He didn't want it. The man who built the most famous brand on earth almost killed its most famous slogan. And that's a recurring thing with Knight. Knight also wanted to badly name Nike Dimension 6. Dan Wieden just looked at him and said, "Just trust me on this one." And Knight trusted him. And that's a lesson by itself, by the way. Sometimes the most important thing a leader does is let someone talk him out of his own bad call. And what happened next is one of the great runs in American business. From 1988 to 1998, Nike's share of the American sports market went from 18% to 43%, and sales went from under $900 million to over $9 billion. By 1989 and 1990, Nike had taken back the #1 spot from Reebok and was pulling away. Now, by the early 90s, Nike wasn't just winning. They were the culture. A massive headquarters in Beaverton, Oregon, the first Nike Town store, Jordan winning championships, the swoosh on everything, everywhere, in every country. The broke kid who sold shoes out of his car had built the most powerful sports brand the world had ever seen. But the same machine that made all those shoes so fast and so cheap was about to become the most famous example of a very ugly problem. And Phil Knight was about to have the worst few years of his professional life. Like most shoe companies, Nike didn't own the factories that made its shoes. They contracted the work out to factories in countries like Indonesia, Vietnam, and China, where labor was really cheap. For years, that was just how business worked, and nobody paid much attention. In the 1990s, people started paying attention. In June of 1996, Life magazine ran a story about child labor. The image that stuck was a photograph of a 12-year-old boy in Pakistan stitching together a Nike soccer ball, and the photo went everywhere. Around the same time, sweatshops were suddenly a national news story in America for other reasons too, and Nike, as the biggest and most visible brand, became the face of the entire issue.
Making clothes for sportswear giant Nike has been caught using forced labor in Malaysia.
It snowballed. College students started protesting on campuses where Nike had deals. There was a group called United Students Against Sweatshops. The Dusenberry comic strip, which ran in newspapers all over the country, started hammering Nike by name. And then in 1997, a report leaked. Nike had hired an accounting firm to inspect one of its factories in Vietnam. And that internal report leaked to the press, and it described workers exposed to a dangerous chemical at levels far beyond the legal limits, and most of the workers dealing with breathing problems, long hours, and very low pay. This was no longer an accusation from the outside. This was Nike's own commission report. Knight had spent 30 years building Nike. He started out of the trunk of his car. He nearly went bankrupt for it. He survived the FBI, survived Reebok, conquered the world, and now his name, his swoosh, the thing he loves most, has become a synonym for the word sweatshop. He was, by his own description later, miserable. Nike's growth stalled. The brand he'd spent 30 years building was taking the worst beating of its life, and the criticism was landing because it was true. Now, on May 12, 1998, Phil Knight walked up to a podium at the National Press Club in Washington, D.C. The most private, press-shy founder in American business stood up in front of the national media to talk about the thing that was destroying his reputation. And to his credit, he didn't dodge the issue. Instead, he said this: the Nike product has become synonymous with slave wages, forced overtime, and arbitrary abuse. That's not a critic saying it. That's not a protester. That's the founder and CEO of Nike saying it out loud in public that his own product had become a symbol for slave wages and abuse. Now, I work with a lot of businesses, and let me tell you, CEOs do not do this. They deny, they deflect, they send a spokesperson, but Knight stood up and said it himself in his own words with his name on it. And then he announced changes. Nike would raise the minimum age of workers in its shoe factories to 18, require cleaner air standards in the factories, matching American workplace rules. It would let outside groups inspect the factories. It wasn't everything the critics wanted, and plenty of them said it didn't go far enough. A few years later, a report literally called, "Still waiting for Nike to do it." I bet they thought that was clever. Argued the problems weren't fixed. And both things are true. The reforms were real, and they were a genuine turning point in how big companies handle overseas labor. They also were not a magic fix, and the criticism kept coming for years. So the lesson isn't that Knight was a saint. The lesson is what he did when he was caught. He had every incentive to lie, to spin, to hide behind PR. Instead, he stood up and named the problem more bluntly than his own critics had. Years later, in his book, Knight wrote that Nike had gone from being the target of factory reforms to a dominant player in reform movement. Now, you can argue about how true that is, but the churn started the day he stopped denying it. Now, by the early 2000s, the crisis had cooled. Nike was Nike again. It was growing. It was dominant. It was the clear number one. But Knight was in his 60s, and he started thinking about the thing every founder eventually has to face. What happens when I'm gone? And then, in May of 2004, something happened that had nothing to do with Nike or business. Phil Knight's son, Matthew, died. He was 34, and he died in a scuba diving accident in El Salvador, where he was doing work for a charity. Now, I'm not going to dwell on this because it's not mine to dwell on, but you can't tell the story of what Knight did next without it. Knight has said it was the worst thing that ever happened to him. I mean, of course it was. 6 months later, in November of 2004, Phil Knight stepped down as CEO of Nike. After 40 years, he handed off the day-to-day running of the company he had built from nothing, though he did stay on as chairman. But the man who controlled every major decision since 1964 was, for the first time, not the one running things. Now, years later, the Knights paid for a new basketball arena at the University of Oregon, the school where all this started for him, and they named it Matthew Knight Arena after his son. That's the kind of thing that puts a whole life in perspective. The money, the swoosh, the empire. He built one of the most valuable companies on earth, and none of it could do a thing about the worst day of his life. So when Knight stepped down as CEO, he handed the job to an outsider, a man named Bill Perez, who ran a big consumer products company, which on paper was a safe, experienced choice. And it lasted about 13 months. Knight's version is that Perez never understood Nike's culture. He even said publicly that under Perez, the company had been running at 80% efficiency. And that's a brutal thing to say about a guy that you hired. But Perez has his own version, and it was that Knight never actually let him go. That you can't run a company when the founder is still the chairman, still the biggest shareholder, still standing behind you watching every single move. And honestly, I think Perez has a point. This is a guy who spent 16 years refusing to let banks tell him what to do, who structured the whole IPO so Wall Street could never take control. Control was the one thing Knight would never give up, which made him a great founder and a nightmare to hand a company to. In early 2006, Perez was out. So Knight tried again, and this time he didn't go outside. He promoted a guy who'd been at Nike almost 30 years, a product design guy named Mark Parker. And Parker got it, because Parker was made of the same stuff as the company, and he went on to run Nike successfully for over a decade, growing it far beyond where it was when Knight left. Now, there's a clean lesson here for anyone building something. The polished outsider failed, and the insider who already carried the company's DNA worked. Culture isn't a poster on the wall. It's the thing an outsider, no matter how qualified, just couldn't fake. Knight learned that the expensive way, burned a year doing it, and then got it right. For another decade, Knight stayed on as chairman while Parker ran the company. And then in 2016, at 78 years old, Knight finally walked away from Nike. On June 30th, 2016, he stepped down as chairman of Nike, and Mark Parker took the chairman title on top of CEO. The lead independent director role, by the way, went to a Nike board member you might have heard of, a guy named Tim Cook, who has a day job running Apple. And although even here, Knight didn't truly disappear. He took a title called Chairman Emeritus, which kept him a standing seat in the room, which is the first hint that walking away didn't mean exactly what you might think. Here's the very last Phil Knight move, and it's so completely on brand for him that I love it. In 1980, when Nike went public, Knight set the whole thing up with a special share structure so that going public could never cost him control of his company. He refused to let Wall Street take the wheel. Well, on the way out the door in 2016, he did it again. He moved his controlling stake into a structure designed to keep control of Nike in his family even after he's gone. He spent his whole life refusing to lose control of this thing, and he made sure that even his own death wouldn't hand it to outsiders. The man did not let go of the wheel. He bolted it onto his family and then walked away. That same year, 2016, Knight published his memoir, Shoe Dog. The private, press-shy man finally told his own story, and it became a national bestseller, and it's the reason a lot of you, and me, know any of this at all. So what does a man do after he builds one of the most valuable brands on earth and finally walks away? He gives away staggering amounts of money, and I mean staggering. Let me list a few of these because honestly, I had to double check the research on this because the numbers are hard to believe. The University of Oregon, he and his wife Penny gave $500 million in 2016 and another $500 million in 2021. To Stanford, where he wrote that business school paper, $400 million to fund a scholarship program. To a cancer research institute in Oregon, he gave a $500 million challenge gift years ago. And then in 2025, a single gift of $2 billion, one of the largest charitable gifts in American history. His total lifetime giving is estimated at around $3.5 billion and climbing. As of recently, his net worth is somewhere around $35 billion. The kid who couldn't get a bank to lend him a few $1,000s in 1965 has given away more money than most companies will ever make. But let's step back and look at what this guy actually did. A shy accountant writes a school paper and builds a company out of his car. He grows broke on purpose for 16 years, survives the FBI, goes public, gets knocked off the top by a company selling aerobic shoes, bets the whole company on the rookie, hates his own famous slogan and gets talked into keeping it, conquers the world, then watches his name become a symbol for something ugly, stands up and admits it instead of hiding it, loses his son, fumbles letting go of the company and then gets it right, and walks away a multi-billionaire who gives it away by the billion. Here's what I keep coming back to with Phil Knight. Now, the story everybody tells is the swoosh and the billions and Michael Jordan. But that's not actually the interesting part as far as I'm concerned. For me, the interesting part is that this guy nearly lost it completely at least 3 separate times. The broke years, Reebok, and the sweatshop crisis. Any one of those could have been the end. And every single time, the thing that saved him wasn't genius, was that he didn't quit. And when he was wrong, he was willing to admit it and change. That's it. That's the whole secret. He outlasted his own mistakes. The highlight reel shows you a man who never lost. The real story is a man who lost over and over and just refused to stay down. Now, if you want the rest of it, the part before any of this, where he built the whole thing out of the trunk of his car and nearly went bankrupt and got investigated by the FBI before Nike was even a household name, that story's on this channel too, and it's on your screen right now.